It was supposed to be the happiest night of her life, a dream wedding, a devoted husband, a future filled with love and promise. But as she stepped into the candlelit honeymoon suite, something felt wrong. She couldn't explain it at first. Maybe it was the way his hand lingered on her back, the way his touch sent a wave of unease through her body instead of comfort. Maybe it was the scent of his cologne, familiar in a way that made her stomach turn. Or maybe it was the way he whispered her name, his voice triggering something buried deep within her memory. And then she saw it, a scar, small, barely noticeable to anyone else, but to her it was unmistakable. A jagged, crooked mark slashed across his wrist. Her breath caught in her throat. The walls seemed to close in. The flickering candlelight blurred as her vision swam. That scar. She knew that scar. She had traced it with her fingers once, not out of love, but out of fear. Years ago, the night she had tried to forget. The night that had stolen her innocence, shattered her world, and left her waking up in cold sweats for years afterward. The night she had never spoken of, because there was no justice to be found. The man who had assaulted her had never been caught. His face had been hidden in the shadows, but his grip, his scent, his voice, those had haunted her every waking moment since. And now, standing in front of her, smiling, waiting for her to come to him, was that same man, her husband. Her hands trembled, but she forced herself to stay still. She forced herself to breathe, to think. He didn't know. He had no idea that she had made the connection, that she had uncovered the truth, that she remembered everything. She felt his hand brush against hers, and she swallowed down the bile rising in her throat. He had taken everything from her once. She would not let it happen again. But this time, the power was hers. And before the night was over, one of them would not make it out alive. Before we get into the chilling details of this story, be sure to like this video and subscribe to True Crime for more real-life stories that will leave you speechless. Emma Carter had always been known for her strength. At 29, she was a dedicated nurse at a Florida hospital, admired by colleagues and patients alike for her compassion and resilience. She had spent years caring for others, offering comfort to the sick, and being a steady presence for those in need. But behind her warm smile and calm demeanor, there was a past she rarely spoke of, a shadow that had followed her since she was 13 years old. She had been a happy, carefree child, raised in a strict but loving home. Her parents, devoted members of their church, had instilled in her the values of faith, kindness, and forgiveness. She grew up in a small Florida town where everyone knew each other, where Sunday mornings were spent in pews, and where trust was rarely questioned. But that trust had been shattered one night. She was walking home from a friend's house just a few blocks away when she heard footsteps behind her. At first, she thought nothing of it. The neighborhood was safe, it was quiet. But within seconds, a hand had clamped over her mouth, yanking her into the darkness of an alley. The next moments were a blur, pain, fear, struggling against the weight of someone much stronger than her. The man had worn a mask. She never saw his face. He had whispered threats in her ear, his breath hot against her skin. She had fought, but it was useless. When it was over, she lay on the cold pavement, staring at the sky, feeling the world spin around her. And then, he was gone. The police investigated. The town rallied behind her, but there was no justice, no answers, no closure. The case went cold, and over time, people stopped talking about it. But Emma never forgot. She spent years trying to heal, throwing herself into her studies, finding comfort in her faith. She became a nurse, dedicating her life to helping others, determined not to let the past define her. And then she met Daniel Wright. Daniel was everything she had ever wanted in a man. At 35, he was a respected preacher, known for his wisdom and kindness. His congregation adored him, hanging on to his every word as he spoke about love, faith, and redemption. He had a presence that made people feel safe, trusted. Emma met him at a hospital fundraiser. He had been there on behalf of his church, raising money for families in need. Their conversation had been easy, effortless. He listened to her, understood her, made her feel seen in a way she hadn't before. Their relationship blossomed quickly. He was attentive, protective, always putting her first. Within months, he proposed, and she said yes. It felt like a miracle. After everything she had been through, she had found a man who truly loved her. But love had blinded her. She had ignored the small things. The way his grip would sometimes tighten just a little too much. The flicker in his eyes when he was angry. The nightmares that would wake her in the middle of the night, leaving her gasping for air, unable to explain why she suddenly felt unsafe in his arms. Still, she convinced herself it was just fear from her past creeping in. That this was God's plan. That Daniel was good. That he was the man she was meant to spend the rest of her life with. And so, on a warm Florida afternoon, surrounded by hundreds of friends and family, she walked down the aisle. Her parents beamed with pride. The church was packed with well-wishers, wiping tears from their eyes as they watched the perfect couple exchange vows. The reception was beautiful, filled with laughter, toasts, and dancing. It was the kind of wedding every girl dreamed of. And then came the wedding night, a luxurious honeymoon suite by the Florida coastline, a room filled with flickering candlelight, soft music playing, the sound of the ocean in the distance. Emma stood in the doorway, watching her husband pour 2 glasses of champagne, smiling at her like a man who had just won everything he ever wanted. She should have been happy. She should have felt safe. But as he handed her the glass, his sleeve slipped just enough to reveal a scar, a jagged, unmistakable mark on his wrist, and suddenly she couldn't breathe. Emma's fingers tightened around the champagne glass. The air in the honeymoon suite suddenly felt too thick, too heavy. Her husband, her new husband, stood before her, smiling, waiting for her to drink. And then she saw it, a scar, jagged, deep, faded with time, but unmistakable. Her mind recoiled, but her body reacted first. Her breathing turned shallow, her hands trembled. She forced herself to blink, to breathe, to stay in the moment. But it was impossible, because suddenly she wasn't in a honeymoon suite. She was 13 again. The street was dark, footsteps behind her, a hand around her mouth, the suffocating weight of fear pressing down on her chest. And then, flashes. A scar on the man's wrist as he held her down, his rough hands, the sickening sound of his voice, low and taunting. "No one will believe you." The words cut through her mind like a blade. Her stomach twisted as she stared at Daniel, his mouth moving, his voice soft and familiar. That same voice, that same voice. It wasn't possible, it couldn't be, but it was. Emma staggered back, the champagne glass slipping from her fingers, shattering on the floor. Daniel's brow furrowed. "Emma, what's wrong?" She didn't answer. Couldn't. Her body screamed at her to run, to get away, to get out. But she was frozen, trapped in the nightmare she had unknowingly walked into. She had married him, the man who had stolen everything from her as a child, the man she had spent years trying to forget, the man she had trusted. And now he was standing in front of her, wearing a wedding ring that matched her own. The walls of the suite seemed to close in. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. She had spent years searching for answers, for justice, for peace. And now the answer was right in front of her. It had been in front of her all along. Daniel stepped toward her. "Emma, talk to me. You're scaring me." His voice was gentle, concerned, loving. But she knew better. The monster she had been running from was standing in front of her, pretending to be a man of God. Tears burned in her eyes, her mind raced. What was she supposed to do? What could she do? She couldn't let him know what she had realized. Not yet. She forced herself to swallow the lump in her throat. I'm fine," she whispered, stepping away, her back pressing against the wall. "Just tired. It's been a long day." Daniel studied her. She saw the flicker of suspicion in his eyes, the slight tilt of his head. But then he smiled. "You're right. It has been a long day." He reached for her hand. She forced herself not to flinch. "Let's get some rest," he said. Emma nodded, but rest was the last thing on her mind. She had a choice to make, and she already knew what she had to do. Emma lay still that night, her body stiff, her mind racing. Daniel's breathing was slow and even beside her. The man she had just vowed to love and cherish for the rest of her life, the man who had shattered her world years ago, slept peacefully. She clenched her fists beneath the sheets. She wouldn't run. She wouldn't let fear dictate her life anymore. She had to be smart. She had to be careful. She had to destroy him. The next morning, Emma moved through their new home with forced ease. She made coffee. She kissed his cheek. She smiled when he spoke. Inside, she was screaming. As soon as Daniel left for his morning church meeting, Emma went to work. She started with church records. Digging through old newsletters, scanned documents, and archived sermons, she looked for anything: dates, travel history, mentions of locations that might match her past. And then she found something. Daniel had spent his early 20s as a traveling youth minister. One of his mission trips, her hometown, the very summer she was attacked. Her breath caught in her throat. She dug deeper. More mission trips, more small towns, more unsolved assaults with eerily similar details. Her hands shook as she scrolled through article after article. This wasn't a coincidence. Daniel wasn't just her monster. He was a predator, and no one had ever stopped him. Emma knew she needed proof. For days she recorded him. She set up a small hidden camera in their bedroom, another in his study. She paid attention to the way he spoke, the way his expression changed when he thought no one was watching. She watched the way he charmed people in public, how effortlessly he played the part of a kind and faithful man. And she watched how quickly his demeanor shifted when he thought he was alone. The mask would drop. The warm, inviting preacher became something else entirely. Cold, calculating. She captured it all. Then one night, she was ready. She sat in their dimly lit living room, the soft hum of a recording playing from her laptop. A voice, his voice, from that night. The exact words he had whispered in her ear as a terrified 13-year-old. "No one will believe you." Daniel stood frozen in the doorway, his face unreadable. Emma didn't blink. She watched him, watched the flicker of recognition, the slight twitch in his jaw, the way his fingers curled into fists at his sides. For the first time since their wedding night, he dropped the act. His eyes darkened. "You should be careful, Emma," he said, his voice eerily calm. "People who dig too deep don't always like what they find." Emma reached into the drawer beside her. Her fingers brushed against cold metal. She had prepared for this. Her hand closed around the gun. Daniel took a step closer. "You've been busy," he murmured, "but it won't matter. No one will believe you." The same words, the same sick confidence. Emma's grip tightened around the weapon. "Say it again," she whispered. He tilted his head. "What?" "Say it again," she repeated, her voice steady now. "Say no one will believe me." A slow smile spread across his face. But before he could speak, Emma pulled the gun from the drawer. His smile faded. For the first time, she saw something new in his eyes. Fear. He lunged at her. Emma fired once, but his hand knocked her arm, sending the bullet into the wall. They crashed to the floor, struggling. His hands were around her wrists, pinning her. She thrashed, kicking, gasping for breath. The gun slid out of reach. Daniel's strength was overwhelming, his weight pressing down on her. She clawed at him, her hands scrambling against the table. Her fingers closed around something sharp, a letter opener. Without thinking, she drove it into his side. Daniel let out a strangled gasp, his grip loosening. She stabbed again, and again. His blood stained her wedding dress. Finally, he slumped to the floor, eyes wide, mouth opening and closing, struggling to speak. Emma staggered to her feet, chest heaving, staring at his lifeless body. The man who had haunted her for years was gone. The silence in the room was deafening. Then, sirens. The neighbors had heard the struggle. Within minutes, the police burst through the door, weapons drawn. Emma raised her hands, the letter opener slipping from her grasp. Tears streamed down her face. She didn't fight. She didn't run. She just whispered over and over, "It was him. It was always him." And for the first time in her life, she knew they would believe her. The moment Emma was taken into custody, the case exploded. News stations ran headlines that seemed impossible to believe. Pastor Daniel Wright killed by his bride on their wedding night. Shocking twist, murder or justice? The world wanted answers. Who was Daniel Wright? Who was Emma Carter? And why did a seemingly perfect love story end in blood? But as investigators combed through the evidence, the truth became even more disturbing. Detectives began by examining Daniel's body. His wounds were defensive. He had fought back. But the real breakthrough came when they processed his DNA. The moment the results came back, the entire case shifted. A match. Daniel's DNA was found in the national database, linked to a cold case, Emma's cold case, the assault from 16 years ago, the case that had haunted her entire life. It had been him all along, and now the world knew it too. But it didn't stop there. Once Daniel's name hit the news, more women came forward. Stories that had been buried, survivors who had been silenced, women who had been attacked by a man they could never identify. Some too afraid to report it, others who had tried but were never believed. Now they had a name. Now they had proof. Daniel Wright wasn't just a respected pastor. He was a serial predator, and Emma had stopped him. But was it justice? That was the question that divided the nation. Some called her a hero, a survivor who finally took control. Others called her a murderer, a woman who had planned, plotted, and executed a man in cold blood. Was it self-defense, or was it revenge? And more importantly, did it matter? The trial was one of the most watched in Florida history. Emma, dressed in white, sat in the courtroom as the prosecution painted her as a woman consumed by vengeance. They played recordings of her research, her hidden camera footage, her search history. They argued that she had a choice. She could have gone to the police. She could have run. Instead, she had stayed, plotted, and killed. But the defense told a different story. They told the story of a woman who had lived in fear for 16 years. A woman who had finally come face to face with her nightmare. And when she did, she had no choice but to fight, to survive, to make sure he never hurt anyone again. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Not guilty. Emma collapsed in tears. Some cheered. Others whispered in disbelief. But the law had spoken. Emma Carter walked free. In the weeks that followed, Emma disappeared from the public eye. No interviews, no statements, just silence. Some say she moved out of Florida, starting fresh in a new town where no one knew her story. Others believe she still carries the weight of that night, forever haunted by what she had to do. But one thing is certain. Daniel Wright was a monster hiding in plain sight, and Emma Carter was the only one brave enough to stop him. What do you think? Did Emma do the right thing? Or did she take justice into her own hands? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more chilling true crime stories, hit subscribe.